Welcome to Taking Stock. I'm Amanda Lang. Coming up on the show, we're taking a special look at critical minerals in Canada, how we plan to make the most of our natural resources, why we aren't moving nearly fast enough, and how creating secure supply is in our strategic interests. That's all ahead. But first, when it comes to critical minerals in Canada, here's what you need to know. Their importance is not in doubt. Used in everything from cell phones to solar energy, critical minerals are essential to our economy now and also in any transition away from fossil fuels. And first off, we're lucky. In Canada, we already produce more than 60 minerals and metals in this category and lead globally in the production of a handful, namely nickel, potash, aluminum, and uranium. The government has prioritized 6 minerals: lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth elements, and has also identified processing the raw materials as a key source of future economic wealth. Electric vehicles and the batteries that sustain them are just one example that could contribute up to $24 billion in GDP by 2030, supporting 81,000 jobs. But while Canada has an early lead on some minerals, other countries, including China, the US, the UK, and Australia, are pushing ahead faster with mine development. And cooling demand for EVs has sent some critical mineral prices down hard. Lithium is down more than 80% in a year, nickel down 50%. That makes funding mines harder to do. Regulatory burdens in Canada create additional roadblocks. In 2023, the value of 23 new projects was actually below the value of 18 projects that got shelved. The federal government is aiming to cut the time it takes to develop a new critical mineral mine by up to 10 years with an improved permitting process. It's also put in place a system of tax credits aimed at supporting the capital requirements of the mines. Still, it's no secret progress has been slow. So what can be done to keep Canada competitive? Jonathan Wilkinson is Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources. Thanks for being with us, Minister. Minister, I wanted to start with your vision for critical minerals in Canada. It's important, obviously, and there are policies that you put in place to be supportive of it. What's your thought about how big a sector this could be for us?
Well, I often describe it when I speak to groups across the country as a generational economic opportunity for Canada. It is, yes, about developing new mines, for sure. But it's also about the processing of critical minerals. It's about the manufacturing of batteries. It's about the manufacturing of finished goods like electric vehicles. It's an end-to-end sort of approach to something that actually can create good jobs and economic opportunity in pretty much every province and territory in this country.
So what needs to happen to really kickstart activity? You've put some policies in place to be supportive of new mines. We aren't really seeing a rush to develop, at least not the speed that some would like to see.
Well, we certainly have put a number of things in place. I think we are seeing momentum, but we would all like it to accelerate more quickly. I mean, we have put in place about $4 billion in supports, including supports for processing facilities, for infrastructure that is just opened, for roads and transmission lines for new mines. We have put into place the 30% tax credit, where we will pay for a portion of the capital costs associated with new mines and for processing facilities. And certainly we are working very much internationally with my counterparts in the United States and in Europe and in Australia, looking at ways in which we can actually make further investments that are going to catalyze all of these things. But as I say, we are thinking very, very much about how we actually tie the minerals part of this through to the downstream processing. And I think we're pretty optimistic about what we will see coming down the pike over the next number of years.
Well, let's talk about the timing then, because, of course, these can move slow. We know even just permitting a mine can take a decade at a fast pace. When you talk about the downstream, the processing, are we talking a couple of decades away? Are you really building for a future that is a long way out?
No, we're not. I mean, there are mines that exist today. There are more coming on stream, like the James Bay lithium mine. There's another lithium mine in Quebec. There's a graphite mine that should be coming on stream the next little while in Quebec. The Marathon mine in Ontario. I mean, we are seeing significant progress. And obviously, you look to develop the processing facilities alongside the development of the mines. But one thing you said at the beginning there is really important, which is it needs to take less time to be able to permit new mines. We need to be able to do things more expeditiously, more efficiently, respecting environmental protection and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. but we have to move faster. And so we have been working as a working group of cabinet ministers on thinking about how we do that in order to be able to shrink the timelines that it takes to get through regulatory processes, not just at the federal level, but at the provincial level too.
Well, and as you note, a big chunk of that is not in your hands. It is in the hands of others. And it's harder today to do these projects than I think we could agree, than it's ever been in our history. What more can you do as a federal government to try to fast track some of the processes that are in the hands of other governments or in the hands of Indigenous groups, for instance? It's not really in your control.
Well, some of it is in our control in terms of some of the regulatory and permitting stuff, and we can find ways to do things faster, but we also have to do them better with provinces and territories. We need to better align the work that we are doing, so we're not asking companies to do different things twice. One of the regulatory pilots that we have working with the British Columbia government under the Regional Energy and Resource Table is exactly about that. It's about integrating all of the regulatory and permitting work so that we actually have a more end-to-end approach that actually addresses all of the requirements that federal and provincial governments have. In terms of Indigenous communities, I mean, look, it is very important that there are consultations with Indigenous communities, but just as important is we need to ensure that there are long-term benefits that would flow back to Indigenous communities coming from these projects. At the end of the day, often people, companies go into these areas and they essentially say we're going to develop a new mine, but out of which the Indigenous community in that area doesn't derive much benefit. That can't happen in the future. We have to find ways to ensure long-term benefits flow back. That will help from a social justice perspective for sure, but also in terms of alignment of interests. And the federal government has said we are going to put into place an Indigenous loan guarantee program that will provide access to capital to Indigenous communities to make investments in these projects so they can partner in these projects.
Which is obviously a huge piece of the puzzle. Access to capital is everything. We've had some complaints lately from folks in the sector that the capital is going elsewhere for a variety of reasons. There's a suggestion that our own pension funds could be, focused more on this kind of activity. And your government has kind of mused about what pension funds might invest in. Is there kind of persuasion that you could bring to bear to make something like the CPPIB put money into Canadian mines?
Well, certainly, I would like to see more Canadian investment in Canada. I think the pension funds should reflect a little bit on the role that they can play in helping to build a strong economy. I would say that's also true for investment funds of the banks. And at PDAC, I have met with a number of folks in that part of the financial community to talk about some of those issues. But it's also incumbent on both the federal government and the provinces to make the conditions such that people actually see that this is a great place to invest. I think it is a great place to invest. I think some of the things that we've actually put into place over the past couple of years will make it an even greater place to invest. But we're also looking internationally about what more can we do. It's historically Canada and Australia have seen each other as competitors in the mining space. I actually have developed a very good relationship with my Australian counterpart, and we actually see each other as collaborators. How can we learn from each other? Because the world needs us both to go a lot faster.
And that's gets us to this point of kind of where we will source the critical minerals we need. Canada's endowed with some already, and your government is focused on some of those already. We've got a head start on them. For some others, we could mine them or we could source them from places like Africa or even China. Do you have a view of kind of the strategy around supply and whether it has to be homegrown?
It doesn't have to be homegrown, and there are some minerals that Canada doesn't have in abundance. We have some cobalt, but probably not. We're not the largest source of cobalt, for example. So we will need to source some of our minerals externally, although the bulk of them hopefully will come domestically. I would say that we as democratic nations are very, very focused on ensuring that there is sufficient supply in countries that do share common values, that we won't find ourselves in a situation 10 years from now that Germany found itself in terms of dependence on Russian natural gas. We cannot be dependent on China for the bulk of what we need in terms of critical minerals, nor processed critical minerals. That doesn't mean that we won't buy anything from China, but it does mean that we can't be in a position where we are highly dependent. That is an energy security issue.
If you fast forward, how long before we are producing what you think we're capable of producing and processing it right here in Canada?
Well, I certainly would like to see significant progress within the next 5 years, and I think a decade from now you're going to see a very different situation than what we have today, where we're producing a lot more of what we need.
And do you see that development as part of a transition away from fossil fuels, or do you see it as a kind of in tandem situation for for the foreseeable future?
Well, certainly there's going to be a role for fossil fuels during the transition. People are still driving gasoline cars by and large, although increasingly, folks are buying electric or hydrogen vehicles. And so there is going to be a transition. We need to ramp up the volumes of critical minerals so that we can build the batteries, so we can build the cars that eventually will eliminate the use of oil and gas in combustion-related applications. That's not to say there won't be continuing use of oil and gas in the future. There are lots of applications of those things that are non-combustion. They don't cause climate change, like lubricants and asphalt and petrochemicals and hydrogen from natural gas. But in terms of combustion applications, we will need to see oil and gas usage decline. And it is certainly concurrent with our ability to actually produce things like critical minerals.
Minister, it's great to have you with us today. Appreciate your time.
All right. Thank you very much.
Jonathan Wilkinson is Minister of Energy and Natural Resources Canada. Coming up, a mining industry veteran says big Canadian pension funds have a role to play in financing our mining future. Stay with us.